Hello everyone, I'm Lianne Lorraine and welcome to Lectures with Lianne. We're here today on the second Friday of the month at 4:00 p.m. at Fred Hess Community Park, where we meet every month for a lecture with Lianne.
So the Battle of New Orleans, for those of you familiar with the battle, I'm not going to go through every arcane skirmish, every little thing. I know some of you probably know the battle, some of you may have fought in it, but I'm not going to go through every little thing. It's the main elements of the battle, which have always been fascinating to me. I mean, the Americans had no right to win that battle, and yet they did. So I'm going to explain how that happened. The war was, well, not technically because the treaty hadn't been ratified yet, but we'll get into that, Lou. We'll get into that. See, it starts already. Any questions, please save them to the end, and I'll be happy to try to answer them. The War of 1812 obviously was part of the Napoleonic Wars, which went from 1803 roughly to 1815. And it was basically Napoleon trying to take over Europe. It was France and Spain against everybody else, basically. Although Napoleon managed to alienate Spain toward the end of the thing, which is one reason that the Battle of New Orleans took place, which I'll explain. The Napoleonic Wars, and the U.S. got involved in it because the British, trying to keep their fleet manned, and I guess you guys probably know this, impressed or stole basically the American sailors off the ships because they're trying to keep their fleets, with a full crew and stuff because they're fighting the French. So James Madison in 1812, which is why it's called the War of 1812, declared war on England. And so they named it Mr. Madison's War. The country was not united behind the war. New England hated it because it interfered with their trade. They did a lot of shipping and a lot of trade out of New England, and they didn't like it. Anyway, that was how that went. Most of the war from 1812 to 1814 was kind of well-known naval battles, one-on-one naval battles, the Constitution and the Guerriere, the Chesapeake and the Shannon. The Americans had some killer frigates, okay, for which you can thank John Adams. He had the frigates built in 1797. The Constitution is the last one of them that's still around, but it's one of the six. There was the United States, the Constellation, the Congress, the Chesapeake, and the President, besides the Constitution. And Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State at the time, did not want to have a Navy. He wanted basically the U.S. to never have an empire, and the way he was going to go about that was to not have ships that could sail the high seas and get into a line of battle with other foreign powers. So Jefferson's idea is you build 200 one-gun gunships, okay, gunboats. They were about a little shorter than the length of this room, and they had one gun each on them. They're 75 feet basically long. And the idea was that if the enemy showed up, they would surround them and sink the enemy's fleet. Okay, now this didn't work out really well, which I'll explain in a minute. This is my one gripe with Jefferson, which I'm sure he can't sleep at night because I have that. But in this era, most of the battles took place near water. And the reason, obviously, for that, and most of the cities are on water, was that overland transportation was very tough. If you're going to transport an army by water is far easier in those days with the condition of the roads than it is over land. And so most of the battles took place either on the water or near the water. And by 1814, the war was basically a standoff, and both countries were trying to get out of the war. England was trying to get out of the war because they were dividing their efforts here, and they were trying to defeat France. This was kind of a sideshow to them. So they're trying to get out of the war. And the U.S. was getting out of the war because it was dividing the country, and they were getting almost bankrupt. I mean, the U.S. was a very young country then, and didn't have, I think they probably were actually going for balanced budgets, which is an unusual thing now. We can't imagine that, but they were trying to do that. So in order to get out of the war, the British developed a plan where they had a three-prong invasion of the U.S. They were going to come down. They had just won Canada from the British in 1759, Battle of Quebec, right? So the British now had Canada without the French interfering with them. Okay, so the British, one of the prongs that they were going to attack, there were three. There was one up here on Lake Champlain. There was one up here in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and then there was the one down here at New Orleans. So the one on Lake Champlain, they came down the Richelieu River from the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they're going to divide off New England from the rest of the country. This was the idea. So they come down, and Thomas McDonough, the famous Commodore in the American Navy, found out about it, and he went over there and defeated them. He sank their ships, which had all the supplies on them for the Army, okay, because you can't haul them over land. They got them in, so they're now at the bottom of Lake Champlain, and the British had to retreat back up into, so the first prong of the thing failed. That was that one. The second one kind of had some famous consequences, and that was they were going to try to take Washington, D.C. So they sail up the Potomac River, and they brush aside the stupid gunboats that Jefferson had made. They were totally ineffective, even though Joshua Barney, who was one of the better commanders in the young American Navy, was the commander of them. They were totally ineffective. So they sail up the Potomac River and famously burn the White House, right? Everybody knows about that. They burned the White House, right? And then they sail back down, and they're going to close the port of Baltimore. And they're going to try and take Baltimore. So they go back over. I mean, D.C. and Baltimore are right next to each other, right? So Fort McHenry, which you've all heard of, was guarding Baltimore Harbor, and the British bombarded it. And Fort McHenry repulsed the fleet, the British fleet. The thing we got out of it was the Star-Spangled Banner, because Francis Scott Key was on one of the ships, and the bombs were bursting in air and all that stuff. And but the British took off, and that little invasion failed also. The third one was down here at New Orleans. And the idea of invading New Orleans was that they were going to cut off the newly won Louisiana Purchase from the U.S. 1803, Jefferson bought it from Napoleon because Napoleon needed the money to finance all his wars. And so they got that. And they were going to cut the U.S. off from everything west of the Mississippi. Meanwhile, of course, I mentioned that both countries were anxious to end the war, and the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war, was signed on Christmas Eve in 1814. Okay, well before the battle, by the way. Was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, but nobody knew about it because, the internet was down, and the cell phones towers had been destroyed, and all that stuff. So nobody knew that the treaty had been signed. So the British, in the previous April, had defeated Napoleon in Spain, famously, and he was exiled to Elba. You guys probably all know about this, but he was exiled to Elba, and so the British all of a sudden had all these free troops to apply to the Americans. So they sent across an invasion fleet commanded by Major General Pakenham, who was the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, by the way. Pakenham was the commander of it, 8,000 British regulars who had just got done defeating Napoleon. They thought they were all that, and so across they came. So here's the basic thing, and right here is New Orleans, and this is where they're doing. And here's Pakenham and his get-up and stuff. Okay, so let's talk about weapons for a minute. The weapons that were used, these two weapons look pretty similar, but they really are not. The bottom one is the Brown Bess smoothbore musket, which had been around for hundreds of years in one form or another, basically a smoothbore musket. It shot a ball of what, Lou, 3/4 of an inch or something like that in diameter. If that thing hit you under 50 yards, you were dead. Okay, you were dead, which worked out great because what they called Napoleonic tactics that they used, and you've seen them where the armies are lined up and the other ones are lined up 50 yards away. No coincidence, because the effective range was like 50 yards, and they blast away at each other. And it seems kind of stupid, right? It seems, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you disperse and not make yourself such a big target? The reason is command and control. Radios were 100 years in the future. And so for the commanding general to maintain control of the troops, you had to have them kind of like in a formation so you could control them. So that's why they ended up doing that. The Brown Bess musket, a good musketeer, and there were more than three, a good musketeer could get off 3 shots in a minute, okay, which was pretty rapid for the day. Now the other rifle it is a rifle actually, the musket's not, is the Kentucky rifle on top, which the Americans had, and which of course was made in Pennsylvania. Why they call it the Kentucky rifle, I don't know. They didn't study geography, but anyway, the Kentucky rifle. Kentucky rifle was a rifle. It had a spiral groove in the barrel, and you rammed the ramrod down, and it was incredibly effective out to 400 or 500 yards, way farther than the musket. Okay, and so the range of it was better and the accuracy was better because it had like a gyroscopic, it was spinning. The grooves in the barrel, were cyclical and it made it spin. So it was like, it had a gyroscopic stability, thank you very much. The problem with it was And the reason that you'd think, well, everybody would do that, everybody would use that because it's more accurate, right? Well, no. The problem is you can only get off 1 shot a minute with that thing because it was hard to ram the ball down the thing. Meanwhile, the enemy's 50 yards away firing at you, and you're dead by the time you get the ball rammed down the barrel. Yeah. So anyway, but the Kentucky rifle, a bunch of Andrew Jackson's troops had those. Andrew Jackson came down to Mississippi, as the song says. The song actually, Johnny Horton's song in 1961, right, when it came out. It's a pretty accurate rendition of what went on. So Jackson comes down the Mississippi River and collects an army of 4,500 guys. He had roughly 1,500 regulars, U.S. regular troops, and then he had pirates, he had Choctaw Indians, he had free blacks, he had Kentucky backwoodsmen, and those are the guys that used the Kentucky rifle. I mean, he was big on diversity before it was cool. But the Kentucky riflemen were, if they couldn't shoot, they didn't eat. Right? They didn't eat because they hunted. So they were really good shots, which made a difference in the battle, which I'll talk about in a second. And here is a cannon from the period. This is actually the battlefield, by the way. This is actually a shot of the battlefield. The river's over there behind those trees, and we're looking west, basically. His line has kind of been recreated. I've got other illustrations of that. But these are the cannons. The cannons went from 8 to 32 pound. That's based on the weight of the shot that the thing fired, okay? But for this battle, the Americans generally used what they call a grape shot, which turns the cannon into a shotgun. Okay, a bunch of little 1-inch balls come out of this thing, but I'm not sure they were 1 inch. They may be smaller than that. But anyway, it turns it into a shotgun. And, when the British are lined up and they fire it, and it big holes in the line, right? And here it shows the way the formations generally were. Here's the British all lined up, nice and neat. Okay, and all that. Now, the British didn't exactly attack that way. When they attacked in column. General Gibbs, who had the main attack in the middle of the line, but in the middle of the line attacked in a column so that he made a smaller target. Except that if you're over on the side of the American line, you could still shoot the guys. The thing that happened, though, is that the American sharpshooters, the guys with the Kentucky rifles, were picking off the British officers. The British officers would typically be in the back of the formation, okay, out of range of the smoothbore muskets, which is what they were used to facing. And the riflemen, the Kentucky riflemen, are sitting there picking them off at 400 yards. They're in the back. And so the British ended up losing most of their officers. This is how Pakenham died, and a bunch of them, Rennie, a bunch of them died that way. I'll go into that in a second. But this is just to show you what the formations look like. This is supposed to be the battle, but it's not a terribly good illustration. So here we have Andrew Jackson, and as I say, he collected a very diverse army, and he had heard that Pakenham had landed, which Pakenham did in the middle of December. He landed down at the mouth of the Mississippi, hot-footed it down, collected his army, and one of the people to help him was John Lafitte, the famous pirate. Okay, John Lafitte. He hated the British because they interfered with his piratical activities. Sounds like Gilbert and Sullivan, huh? Anyways, piratical activities. And he knew the territory really well. And one of the things that he told Jackson is that there's a sandbar in the river, and the British are not going to be able to get past it. Okay, and so here's where you want to set up your line, just up from where the British are going to have to get off their ships. Anyway, and where you set up the line, I'll show you okay, here it shows the British kind of sailing around. There were some skirmishes beforehand, and even though the Americans lost a couple of them, it gave Pakenham new respect for the Americans' fighting ability, because they were pretty fierce opponents. Here is where the British landed, right here. And here is Jackson's line, that tiny little squiggly blue thing there. There's Jackson's line, and the sandbar in the river was somewhere down here, and so they went there to get the closest they could. And so here is a contemporary illustration of the battlefield. It's not too clear, except here's the river. Here's Jackson's line right here. All this stuff over here that looks like clouds is a swamp. Okay, it's a cypress swamp, and Jackson had his line anchored on the cypress swamp on the left and the river on the right, so he couldn't get flanked, all you military guys. He couldn't get flanked by the British. Here's a somewhat contemporary illustration of it. So here's the British Army back here. There are the formations. Here is the Rodriguez Canal. Now, the line that Jackson set up was about 7 feet high, and in front of it was what they called the Rodriguez Canal, which was an irrigation canal. Right now, it's barely a little ditch, and you can't hardly even, tell what it was. If they didn't have a sign on it, you wouldn't know. But the Rodriguez Canal is about 20 feet wide in the day, and it was too deep to ford. So the British had what they call fascines, okay, which are bundles of sticks that they made. They're going to throw it in the river or throw it in the canal, and they would walk across on those things. And they would fill it up with those, okay? And then they had ladders that they're going to climb up and this is all while the Americans are right there blasting away, right, at them. So it was a pretty tenuous deal. As I say, the English had 8,000 men, and the Americans had 4,500, which that's pretty dicey odds if you're the attacking army. Generally, you want 3 to 1. If anybody studied Clausewitz or any of those guys, it's generally you want 3 to 1 if you're attacking a fixed position. But he had 8,000, and most of the British, our officers, had very little regard for the Americans' fighting ability until the battle was over. Here is another illustration. The British weren't exactly in this kind of formation. There's Jackson's line, there's the swamp, there's the river. The boats out in the river didn't play too much, at this point, too much of a role in the battle. And then you got the British reserves back here under General Lambert and all that. So this is a pretty good illustration of the battle itself. On the left here, along the river, by the way, I don't know what that boat's doing in the river. That's like a Civil War era boat, okay? It's a side-wheeler. There's no way that boat was in the river. So whoever did this is smoking something, I don't know. Anyway, it was dawn on the 8th of January. So this is almost the 210th anniversary. It's 2 days late, but the lecture's on Friday. I couldn't change it. I could have changed the battle, but anyway, never mind. The first thing that was supposed to happen, there was a heavy fog, and it concealed the British Army from the Americans, okay? And Pakenham was counting on that. And he had the fascines back there, and Lieutenant Colonel Mullins was supposed to bring the fascines up with the first wave and throw them in the canal and stick the ladders up on the front and take the American position. But the first thing that was supposed to happen is there's a little road that runs right along. Lianne and I went to this battlefield. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I love battlefields, but this is a fascinating one. There's a road along the river right here that goes actually up to New Orleans. So there's road, and so Rennie's attack here comes right up along this, and the idea was to take these guns on the right of the American line. From the American perspective, it was the right of the line, right? Take these guns and turn them on the American troops, which were, in other words, they could mow them right down, right? Fire right down the line, right? Well, they do. They get up there and they take the guns, and what do? They let out a big cheer, and and Americans hear them, and they look over there and they kill him. They killed Rennie. And the British troops were all like demoralized, and they retreated. And so that part of it didn't work out too well. And then we have the main attack is here. And what happened, unfortunately for Pakenham, was that the fog lifted just as they were starting to cross the field, okay? And so here's Major General Gibbs' attack here in the middle. He goes up, and they get up to the Rodriguez Canal, and the Americans are blasting away the whole time. And what happens? They forgot the fascines. They left them back at the back. I'm not kidding. It sounds like a comical thing, but this is actually what happened. And the British blamed Lieutenant Colonel Mullins, who was in charge of getting them up there, for the loss of the battle because they couldn't get across the Rodriguez. So Pakenham, here he's at the back because the senior officers are always at the back, although Jackson was almost in the line here. But anyway, Pakenham tells the 93rd Highlanders, and here is where they went, right? 93rd Highlanders, there's 900 of them. And he says, get up there and reinforce the attack. You can see where they went right across the field, right in the face of the American guns. They started out with 900 guys, and by the time they got up here, they had 130 left. They were just slaughtered by the cannons and just right, you can imagine the line here is blazing away, and there were 130 of them left. It's looking pretty bleak at that point, and Pakenham gets together here they are. This is 93rd Highlanders. You can tell by their outfits. Their hats are the dead giveaway. This is the 93rd Highlanders. It shows them with ladders. They didn't actually have ladders. when they got there. It's a artistic license, I guess, or something. But anyway, here they are, and there's Jackson's line right up there. And so there, but you can see it's chaos. I mean, and Americans are right up here, and they're blasting away into them. And here they are again. I doubt that Jackson was standing on the line with using a rifle as a club. I really doubt that might have been a campaign. And when he ran for president, maybe it was a campaign. So Pakenham gets together roughly a regiment size of guys to get the fascines and the ladders and take them up to the front where they were needed, because the British were all getting slaughtered. And what happens? The American riflemen pick off Pakenham, and he dies. Here he is dying, right here. This is a kind of a crude picture, but here he is dying. This is General Lambert here. He's pointing to the rear, saying, "I think it's time to boogie," because things aren't going that well and stuff. He's dying. Here's the British sort of figuratively marching toward the rear. And this is another shot taken from behind or another painting, obviously 19th century painting, taken from behind the American lines. The entire battle lasted 40 minutes, okay, which is about the time of this lecture. It lasted 40 minutes. The British lost 2,200. I mean, nobody was standing there counting, right? But, the field was covered with British redcoats. It was just, they were slaughtered. 2,200 the British lost, the Americans lost 62, okay? And the reason, of course, is the Americans are behind the barricade, and it was hard for the British to hit them. Now, contrary to Johnny Horton's song, which makes it sound like the Americans chased them down the river with the hounds, they ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them, that one, they didn't chase them. And, there was a lot of discipline there, because the British still outnumbered them tremendously, and the British could have wheeled about and won the battle if the Americans had abandoned their position and chased them down the river. So they let them go there, and they stayed down there for like 3 weeks at the mouth of the, but the Americans, they were letting well enough alone. So 5 days after the battle ended, word got to the battlefield that the Treaty of Ghent had been ratified, or had been signed. It wasn't ratified until late February by Parliament and by Congress. But the treaty had been signed, and therefore the battle was kind of moot, right? But nobody knew that at the time. So the British are trying to salvage some shred of dignity after this. There's a fort down at an old Spanish fort built in 1756 at the mouth of the Mississippi called Fort St. Philip, which, if you study the Civil War, that was still around. You may have Fort Jackson and St. Philip. You know what Fort Jackson was named after, Fort St. Philip. And they decide they're going to bombard that and see if they can take it. Well, they failed at that too. Fort St. Philip repelled the ships, and they went back to England, and that was it. 6 months later, Napoleon was defeated. He came back from Elba, right? And he got his army together. 6 months later, he was defeated at Waterloo, and that was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So this took place right toward the end of the war. Anyway, that's how it happened.
If you'd like to know more about our lecture schedule, you can check it out on Facebook at Lectures with Lianne. If there is an idea you have for a lecture or something that you think we should cover, please contact me at palasvertispulse@gmail.com. Please come and join us on the second Friday of the month at 4:00 p.m. at Fred Hess Community Park for another interesting, entertaining, and informative lecture with Lianne. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.